Welcome to the 8th tutorial in the Introduction to Programming with Python series. In this tutorial, we're going to start looking at looping mechanism, specifically the for loop. We're going to look at looping over lists, dictionaries, and looping over other loops. Then we'll look at an exercise and what we're going to do next time. In the last two tutorials, we had to do exercises that required us to repeat the same code over and over. You will recall our last exercise asked you to repeat the same code block 5 times, so you can allow the user to inquire or add 5 different names to the grades dictionary. Now imagine if we wanted to do that more than 5 times. Repeating code is bad design. You wouldn't want to keep copying and pasting the same code block 20 or 30 times. What if we don't even know the number of students there are? How do we know when to stop when we reach the number of students in that class? Also, when you write a code block more than once, you will have to fix it more than once if it's broken. Finally, and since good programmers are inherently lazy, they don't like to write code more than once. All in all, it's best if we write the code block that we want once and have it executed multiple times as needed. As you can guess, programming languages offer us looping mechanisms to do just that. In Python, we're going to look at two types of loops, the for loop and the while loop. The for loop executes a block of code a specified number of times, once per list or sequence item that you want to iterate over. To clarify that, we're going to look at an example in idle. But before we get into our for loop example, I'd like to mention that we'll be doing the examples directly in idle. So previously, in the previous tutorials, we were opening a new file, writing the if statement in it, and we did that because I wanted to make sure that you understand what a code block is and how it was indented and so on. Now you can do the same thing in idle, and I'm going to show you that with an if statement in a code block. So basically, if we wanted to do something that has a code block, like an if statement, we can do if, let's give it something to test, and we can do if age, let's say, is more than 10. And previously what we saw with idle is whenever we hit enter, the statement that we were writing would execute. And that always works, except if the last thing we type is a colon. And so basically the colon tells Python that we're starting a new code block. And so idle, the interactive shell, will know that. And it won't execute that one statement. It will allow you to enter the rest of your code block, and then it will execute the whole thing at once. So if I hit enter now, that statement, the if statement, won't be executed. It'll allow me to continue entering my code block, and you'll notice that it indented the cursor all the way to here so that I can enter the code block under the if. So let's say I can print age more than 10. This is just a quick illustration. And then I can hit enter. I can add more code statements. I can do backspace, which would exit that. Now, I want an else, and that also works. And you can notice that it indented it for me. Now the if and the else are not at the same level because of the beginning of the line. Okay, but don't worry about that. It works just fine. Print. Okay, and then I hit enter, and I can still enter more statements, and it will execute the whole block when I hit enter twice. So when I hit enter the second time now it executes the whole if and else statement. So age is less than 10. I just wanted to show you that because we're going to do the for loops directly in idle, and I didn't want that to be confusing. So here's how this works. You've seen how we do the if statements in a separate file, and here you can see that we can do the same statements directly in idle. Okay, so now let's go to the for loop. So the way the for loop works, it works on a list. So we have to have a list first. So let's go back to our courses example that we've been looking at from the last time. So I start with a list, and then I can define my for loop. So I go for, and here I have to introduce a new variable name. Now, this variable is not defined before. I don't have to predefine it. All I have to do is mention this name inside the for statement. So for, and a new variable name, I'm going to call it course name because I'm iterating over course names here. So again, the variable name should be meaningful. In, and the list name, and then a colon, which will indicate that I'm starting a new block. So this is how you define a for statement. Again, you go for, then you define a variable name, and I'll show you what this variable name will be used as. Again, this variable name does not have to be defined before, so it's any new name that we choose, and it should be meaningful to the items inside the list. In this case, I have course names in here, so I called it course name. I hit enter, and I'm going to print I am taking, and I'm going to string format it like we've seen before. And let's see what it does. So it says I'm taking English, math, programming, and science. So what this for loop did is it iterated once over every item in my list, and every time it did that, it assigned the item to this variable name I created here. So what I told it to do is iterate over the courses list and execute this code block. And for each time you iterate over an item, assign this item to this variable name. So inside of this code block, the first iteration, course name would be assigned to the first item. The second iteration, course name would be assigned to the second item, and so on. And inside of the code block, I can use the course name, and you can see what the results are in here. So this is a quick look at the for loop, and this is how we can use it to iterate over lists or sequences. Now let's take a look at a more advanced example. In the list tutorial, your exercise was to prompt a user to enter 4 course names and build a courses list that way. Though, you had to do something like that. You had to prompt the user 4 times, and you had to repeat the code, and when you had prompted the user 4 times, you created your list using the 4 names that the user had entered. Right. Now, this is boring, repetitive, and not very flexible because we forced the user to enter the 4 course names, not 3, not 5, not anything else. It would make a lot more sense to ask the user how many courses are you taking. That way we give the user the flexibility to enter whatever number of courses they happen to be taking, right? Now in the previous slide, we saw that we can iterate over an existing list. So we had created a courses list. Like we have a list now, we know how to iterate over it using a for loop. But if I wanted to build a list, so basically let's do the exercise starting with an empty list. And my goal is to prompt a user, how many courses are you taking? The user may enter 3, and I'm going to, using a for loop, execute a code block 3 times that would ask the user to enter their course name and add it to the list. So how we do that is using the range function. Because I don't have an existing list, I need to create one. In Python, for loops always execute over sequences. A list is a type of sequence, as I have mentioned before. Another type of sequence that we can use in a for loop is the range. So let's see that in the example. Let's ask the user how many courses they're taking. And let's say the user might say 5. And remember, this is a string. I need to convert it to an integer. And now I have 5 as an integer, not as a string. And now I can use it in my range function. Range is a built-in function. You can go range and you can give it any number, let's say 5. And it will display range from 0 to 5. For our purposes, you can assume that this is a list of number that starts at 0 and stops before 5. So it's a list that will contain 5 numbers, whatever number you give it. So let's say 5. And it will start at 0. So it'll say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I do something like for index in range, let's use the number of courses the user entered. So you can see here that I can use the range function to create essentially a list of numbers from 0 to that number minus 1. So 5 times essentially, and I can use that in a for loop to execute my code block 5 times. And this is really what I want. So what I want is for index, and remember I have to create a variable name here, and each time that variable name would be assigned the next item in that sequence. So because the sequence was a list of numbers from 0 to 4, when I print the index, it'll give me 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So for index in range, number of courses. Now I don't really need to use the index here. I was simply using it here to illustrate. But in here, I have to indicate the variable name, but I don't have to use it inside the code block if I don't have to. And in this case, I don't have to. So I'm going to say course name. All I really want to do is execute that code block the number of courses time, in this case 5 times, prompt the user, enter your course name, okay, and then add that to the courses list, and I can use the append function. Okay, enter again, telling idle to execute, and now it's going to say enter your course name. So as you can see, this allowed me to execute the code block that I want a specific number of times without having a list to begin with. And now I can see that my courses list is the list that I was looking to build, and it is a flexible way to basically build lists by using this range function. We saw how we can improve on the list exercise we did in the list tutorial. And in the same way, we can also improve on the dictionaries exercise we did by using a for loop. That for loop would allow the user to create a flexible class grade dictionary. And that will be our exercise. But for now, let's see how we can iterate over a dictionary item. So this is something you're going to need for the exercise. If we had a dictionary, let's say Mary with 80, John with 70, I can iterate over that similarly to how I can iterate over lists, except in the list, you only have one item. You have a list of items, and for every iteration in the for loop, it will go to the next item. Here you have key value, and so what it will do is the for loop would actually iterate over the keys. So the first time it would go Mary, the second time it would go John, or John, then Mary. Because remember, this is a dictionary, and the order is not guaranteed. And so again, just like the lists, I need to create a variable name. It doesn't have to be defined before. And it should be something that's meaningful. Since it's going to iterate over the keys, which are student names, I'm going to call it name. In, and you go grades. So the grade for this name is, and we're going to give it the grade, and we're going to use string formatting as usual. So the name is the first one, and here I need the value. I have the key, which is the name, so I can use it to get at the value belonging to that key. And here you can see that I can iterate over dictionary items, and as I mentioned, the order is not guaranteed, so how it came out is John came out first and Mary came out second. And this is how you can iterate over dictionaries. Now the code block inside the for loop is a Python code block, and so it can include any valid Python statements, including other for loops. So you can have loops over loops, and this is fairly useful when you're looking at lists of lists or dictionaries of lists. So to look at an example of that, let's say we were building a dictionary where the key was a student name and the value was the list of courses that student is taking. So let's say the student courses is an empty dictionary. And let's say for the key John Smith, we can have a value, and the value can be the list of courses, right? So remember what we said about dictionaries is the value can be anything, including other dictionaries or lists. And maybe she's taking science. Of course, Muhammad Ali will be taking boxing. Now, if you look at the student courses, you can see that it's a dictionary where the key is the name and the value for each one is a list of the courses that person, that student is taking. So let's say I wanted to print that in a reasonable manner because this just looks confusing. So what I can do is I can do a for loop for name in student courses, right? And here my courses list for that student would be, right? Because remember the value, student courses at key name, is a list. So if I assign it to a new variable, courses, well now courses is a list. So for Mary Bravo, it would be a list that has science and math. For John Smith, it would have English and math. For Muhammad Ali, it would have boxing and science. And let's see how that works. So now I have a list of courses. So now I'm going to say print the person name is taking the following courses, right? So I'm printing that in the main for loop. And now I'm going to iterate over, right, each course name in the courses that person is taking. And I'm going to say print. And I'll leave a few spaces, right? I'll create a few spaces. That way the course names are indented below the student name. And here, again, string formatting, which I forgot to do, name. Remember, because %s, well, it would need something after it to print. Otherwise, it would just print %s. So %name, this would print the student name. %s, %course name, this would print the course name. And let's see what that will do. So the main for loop would iterate over the names, the keys in the dictionary student courses. And for each one, I look at the value, which is another list, which is a list of courses that person is taking. We iterate over that list. So you see here we have a for loop inside of a for loop. And this allows us to essentially print the student names and the courses each student is taking in a better manner. We call it pretty printing. So this is a simple look at for loops within for loops. We're going to look at a bit more complicated example in the next slide. I'm going to show you how to build a multiplication table using a for loop within a for loop. And this might look complicated, so if you don't fully understand it or why it works, don't worry. It's not something that you're expected to know how to do at this point. I just wanted to show you that we can do some cool things with just a few lines of code. Okay, so let's say I wanted to build a simple multiplication table, let's say from 1 to 9. I can do something like this. Now, I can create my numbers, right? I can do that, but I don't have to do that. I can use the range function, and I can go 1 and stop at 10. And if I do numbers, it will say range from 1 to 10. Then I can convert that to a list. And if I do numbers, it will say numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and up to 9. And then I can do something like this for x in numbers. And now here I could have set for x in range 1 to 10, but I wanted to show you that we can use a for loop within a for loop, and both loops can work on the same list. For y in numbers. So you see here what we're doing is we're iterating using the variable name x over the list numbers. So the first time the outer for loop will execute, x will be 1. And while x is 1, the inner for loop will execute all the way from 1 to 9. So the first iteration of the inner loop, x would be 1, y would be 1. The second iteration of the inner loop, x would be 1, y would be 2. Then it would be x equals 1, y equals 3, and so on up until x is 1 and y is 9. And then the inner for loop ends because it iterated over 1 to 9. And so it goes back to the second iteration of the outer for loop. Now x is 2. And for x equals 2, we would iterate y equals 1, then y equals 2, then y equals 3, and so on. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to print x times y, a multiplication table. Now we've seen that when we print, it will basically print enter at the end of whatever you printed. So it would create a new line. But if I don't want it to create a new line because I'm within the inner loop, so basically I want the one multiplication table to be on the one row, then the two multiplication table on the second row, and so on. I'll show you what comes out like that. But basically, instead of a new line, I'm going to tell it basically just put a space. This is for the inner loop, remember. And when the inner loop finishes, I'm just going to say print. And basically that will end the row and move on to the second line. And you can see here that with just a few lines of code, I can create a simple multiplication table for numbers from 1 to 9. So again, this is for x equals 1, this is for x equals 2, this is for x equals 3, and so on. So for x was equals to 1, what we did is print 1 times 1, 1 times 2, all the way to 1 times 9. And instead of creating each one of them, instead of printing each one of them on a new line, we said end it with a space. And that space is basically this. So even after the 9, you will see that we have a space. And then the for loop, the inner for loop for y in numbers exits, and then we print nothing. We just basically tell it to print, which will print a new line and move the cursor basically from here to here. And now x equals 2. And while x is equal to 2, I'm going to iterate again for y over all the numbers from 1 to 9. So this is x equals 2, y equals 1, x equals 2, y equals 2, and so on. Spaces between them, and when it finishes, the inner for loop will exit, and a print statement will execute, printing a new line, causing us to go to the third line, and so on. We can even print it in a nicer way. We can even put headers on top, 1 to 9, and also from top to bottom. This is, again, I just wanted to show you quickly how we can do more advanced, more interesting things with for loops. Hopefully you get the idea and don't get too afraid of trying things. The worst thing that could happen if you print something that IDLE doesn't like is IDLE will say, you know what, this doesn't work. So don't worry when it doesn't work. This thread doesn't mean anything bad. It just tells you that name error, this thing does not exist. So give it a try, keep trying things, and that is how we learn. Our exercise for today will be to build a simple but more flexible solution to the exercise we did last time for dictionaries. So what I'd like you to do is to write a Python program that will ask the user how many students do you have, and based on that number, obviously using a for loop, you will ask the user enter a student name, enter a student mark, and set that name and mark in your grades dictionary. You don't have to initialize the dictionary to anything. It'll start with empty, and then that number of times you'll ask the user enter name and mark. If the user enters the same name more than once, it will overwrite the previous entry, which is fine. When the user has finished that number of times, you will say your class grade list is as follows. Okay, and print it. Except we're not going to print it like we used to before, because now that we know how to use for loops, we can print it in a better way, in a more user-friendly way. So just quickly over that, previously what I said is, let's say you had a grades dictionary. What I asked you to do is just print it. Like this, right? Now, this is not exactly the best way to print something to the user, but at the time, we did not know how to pretty print this. So now we're going to look at it. We're going to look at how to print it better. So the program you will write will do something like this when it runs. How many students do you have in your class? Let's say I say 5. And so 5 times it will ask, enter the student name, mark, and when I've done that 5 times, it will say your class grades are as follows. Okay, so now I'm printing it in a more user-friendly way. So you will notice that it's not necessarily sorted by key. So Ali may have come out first, but this is just random. Bob is on the bottom instead of being second. At some point in time, we're going to look at sorting based on the string or the number. But for now, you'll just print it as Python will give it to you in the for loop. Okay, but this looks a lot better. I think you'll agree than this does. So this is our exercise for next time, and a link to the solution will be provided as usual in the description of the video. Next time, we're going to look at while loops and breaking out of a loop. Until then, live long and prosper.